Yom HaShoa, the Holocaust Remembrance Day, this year begins on the evening of April 7th. Is it a day set aside for Jews to remember the Holocaust? It was established by law in Israel in 1959. In Israel, at 10 a.m., an air raid siren throughout the country is heard, and Israelis observe 2 minutes of solemn reflection. Even if they're in a car, they stop where they're driving and they get out of the car and they observe the 2 minutes of reflection. Tonight, we're going to do our own special commemoration of Yom HaShoa. And so it's my pleasure to turn the program over to Susan Isaacs.
Dear friends, welcome and thank you for joining us for Yom HaShoa, a time set aside to remember the victims of the Holocaust. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Susan Isaacs. I am the proud daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors. But I was not always proud. As a young child, my mother's stories about Auschwitz confused me. I could not understand why my parents were being punished that way. Were they bad people? If they were good people, why did God punish them so severely? Maybe I was too young to hear their stories. Maybe I was told too much, too soon, and too often. But in spite of what they endured, my parents also had a wonderfully cheerful side to them. My dad, Adolf, was a great joke teller. My mother, Flora, had a beautiful voice and loved to sing. In fact, during her darkest days in Auschwitz, she would sing to the women just to keep their spirits up. My parents taught me and my brother to be proud Jews and how important it was to love the state of Israel. I am very proud of them. I just turned 70 years old, and now I understand a lot more. But I'll never fully understand how the Holocaust could have happened. But I know it's my obligation to teach my children and grandchildren our family's history. My story is not unique. I share a common history with thousands of other children of survivors. My parents were born in Czechoslovakia. My mother spent over a year in the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp, and my father was in a slave labor camp in Poland. Most of their families were murdered by the Nazis. My parents were grateful to survive, although they lived the rest of their lives with guilt, fear, anxiety, and trauma. But they also lived with the hope for a better life for their children and grandchildren. Our program today will focus on the Theresian concentration camp and the 15,000 children who passed through there between 1942 and 1944. Less than 100 of these children survived. These children were all under the age 15. We will be reading their poems and showing some of the drawings of the young prisoners of Theresian. The drawings and poems are all that is left of these children. Their ashes have long disappeared from the fields around Auschwitz. But their drawings and poems speak to us. These are their voices that have been preserved, voices to live forever as a reminder of truth and hope. The ghetto of Theresian, which was called Theresienstadt in German, was outside the hills of Prague. It was an unusual concentration camp because it was created to cover up the Nazis' genocide of the Jews. It was called the Führer's gift to the Jews. There was a high proportion of artists and intellectuals interned in Theresienstadt, and culture flourished in the camp. But alongside of that was starvation, disease, and the constant fear of being transported to the death camps of the East. Every one of its inhabitants were condemned in advance to die. Theresienstadt was the site of the famous Red Cross inspection visit in 1944. The Red Cross officials looked around, they asked polite questions, and were impressed with what they saw. To this day, it is not clear if they were fooled or if they gave a positive report to the world, because there was little else they could do or little else they wanted to do. When the word got out that I was preparing this program for tonight, several women reached out to me. Some visited Theresen and sent me pictures they took. Another woman told me her mother survived the camp. And another told me that 2 of her husband's aunts were among the 100 children that survived. What a remarkable connection. As we hear the poems and see the drawings, we can witness a maturity beyond these children's years. These are haunting reminders of what no child should ever have to see. In memory of these innocent children and the millions who perished, please join me for a moment of silence before we start our program. The women that I am now going to introduce are all Eilat members and daughters of Holocaust survivors. Our first speaker this evening is Sandy Cohn, who will briefly tell us about her parents' experience in the Holocaust and then recite the poem Homesick. Sandy?
Thank you, and hello everyone. My father, Michael Chodesh, later pronounced as Chadash, was one of 5 children and the sole survivor of the family. His father produced custom leather products such as saddles, tool belts, and many other products. In 1941, the Nazis entered the eastern part of Poland, which had been occupied by the Russians. Because my father spoke and wrote in Russian, my grandfather decided that my father could cross the border and successfully make his way into Russia wearing the family money belt. He worked all sorts of jobs during the war. At the tail end of the war, he, along with other survivors, made their way across the Swiss Alps and stayed in many safe houses along the way to Milan, Italy. There he stayed in a villa until he boarded a ship that was headed to Palestine. My mother, Rose Blecker Chadash, was also born in Poland. She was one of 5 children, of which 3 survived. She was 15 years old when the Nazis invaded the eastern part of Poland, and she fled with her older brother into Russia. She too spoke and wrote in Russian. She was housed in many of the Russians' homes while working different jobs. She, along with a friend, boarded Exodus 47. It was the first of 5 missions to bring the survivors to Palestine. The journey was fraught with danger as the British ship rammed the Exodus. A battle ensued on top deck with one of the volunteers dead and one who was taken prisoner. My mother remembers sitting near the spot where there was a large gaping hole, with her feet dangling in the Mediterranean Sea. Newsreels recorded the journey of the fugitives as the ship, which was an old Chesapeake Bay coastal passenger ship, which was intended for 300 people and actually had 3,500 people on board. The Haganah circled the boat and asked all the refugees not to disembark as the world was watching. The boat was no longer seaworthy, and 5 Greek freighters came to the rescue, ensuring that the refugees made their way to the shores of Haifa. Exodus 47 was known as the ship that launched the nation. Hold on. It was in Haifa that my parents met. That's it. My poem is called Homesick. Is this going to come across the screen?
Yes. Give me a second.
Sure. I've lived in the ghetto here more than a year, in Terezin in the Black Town now. And when I remember my old home so dear, I can love it more than I did somehow. Ah, home, home. Why did they tear me away? Here the weak die easy as a feather, and when they die forever. I'd like to go back home again. It makes me think of sweet spring flowers. Before, when I used to live at home, it never seemed so dear and fair. I remember now these golden days, but maybe I'll be going there again soon. People walk along the street. You see at once and each you meet that there's a ghetto here, a place of evil and of fear. There's little to eat and much to want, whereas bit by bit it's horror to live. But no one must give up. The world turns and times change, yet we all hope the time will come when we'll all go home again. Now I know how dear it is, and often I remember. This was written anonymously, and it was March the 9th, 1943. And it was found, this little sheet of paper was later found.
Thank you, Sandy. I've known you for 40 years and I never knew your parents' story. It's quite a story, and I
This is an abridged version, I have to tell you.
appreciate you sharing it with all of us. Thank you so much. The next person I'd like to introduce is Etty Moldavin. Etty will speak a little about her parents' experience and then read the poem, The Butterfly. Etty?
Can anybody hear me?
Yes.
My internet is giving me problems. Okay.
Now we can see you. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, everybody's coming in and out. My internet is really bad. Okay, but you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, with my parents, unlike with Sandy and with Susie, they did not talk about their experiences in the Holocaust. They found it very difficult to speak, and I got tidbits growing up, but you know that I know they were in the Holocaust. I know they lost most of their family. My mother had only 2 sisters left. My father had 1 brother left, and they came from fairly large families. They were both in the war and both had different kind of experiences. I know my mother, I learned later on in life, was beaten in the forest, strictly because she was Jewish. I know that she was in line with her mother, and her mother and her were separated, and it was the last time she saw her. And growing up with my mother, I knew that she had things that idiosyncrasies, like she was afraid of the dark. And as a child, I didn't know why, but I slowly figured that out. And our house always had to have bread. Bread was very important because they didn't have any. So it's like, if you had bread, you were good. Now, my father, he spoke even less about things, but he did tell me that he was shot in the hand and right through the palm of his hand, almost lost his hand. But he said, as though he made it as though nothing was, that it not to tell me what happened, but it's not like he was in a war and somebody was they were shooting back and forth to each other. So my assumption is that he was shot for doing something. Maybe he stole bread. I don't know. I know that he was on long walks, and I know that they couldn't stay awake. It was freezing cold, and they would just take cigarettes to keep themselves awake so that they can continue the walk. And 2 things that we weren't allowed to have in the house, which only if you're Jewish, I think, will register, is my father would not allow anybody to wear yellow in the house or stripes. So we couldn't wear striped shirts. I didn't understand that for most of my childhood. It wasn't until much later that I grasped what they were saying. So with little that I knew about their own experiences, it comes across in their daily lives. And that was it.
Eti, can you read your poem now, The Butterfly?
Oh yeah, sorry. I forgot myself. Okay, it's called The Butterfly. The very last, so richly, brightly, dazzling yellow. Perhaps if the sun's tears would sing against a white stone. Such a yellow is carried lightly way up high. It went away, I'm sure, because it wished to kiss the world goodbye. For 7 weeks I've lived in here, penned up inside this ghetto, but I have found my people here. The dandelions call to me and the white chestnut candles in the court. Only I never saw another butterfly. That butterfly was the last one. Butterflies don't live in here, in the ghetto. This was by Pavel Friedman from 1942.
Thank you so much, Eti. Interesting, but my parents never shared that about us not wearing stripes or having yellow in the house. It's a very interesting insight. Thank you for sharing your experiences. We'll now move on to our next speaker, who is Rachel Kurtz, who will talk a little bit about her parents' experience in the Shoah, and then we'll read the poem Fear. Rachel?
Rachel, can you unmute yourself? We can't hear you, Rachel. Rachel, you're still on.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can, yes.
Okay. Also, both my parents didn't speak much about the Holocaust. My mother more so than my dad. My dad hardly said anything. My mother was too painful for her to talk about it, so she would just tell me just a few details here and there. My father was not in the Holocaust. He escaped to Russia and he joined the Russian army. But my mother was at the Auschwitz first with her sister and her aunt, and then they were shipped to Theresienstadt, and she was there until they were liberated. And then my dad and my mom went on the Exodus on their way to Israel, and that's where they met. And but they ended up in Cyprus in the camps occupied by the British at that time. And that's where I was born. So I was born in Cyprus, and I was 2 months old when I went to Israel. So that's my story. And now I'll read the poem. The poem Fear.
Yes, please.
Today the ghetto knows a different fear. Close in its grip, death wields an icy scythe. An evil sickness spreads a terror in its wake. The victims of its shadow weep and writhe. Today a father's heartbeat tells his fright, and mothers bend their heads into their hands. Now children choke and die with typhus here. A bitter text is taken from their bands. My heart still beats inside my breast while friends depart for other worlds. Perhaps it's better, who can say, than watching this to die today. No, my God, we want to live, not watch our numbers melt away. We want to have a better world. We want to work. We must not die. And this was by Eva Pikova, 12 years old, Nuremberg.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for sharing your parents' experience and for reading the poem so beautifully. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll now move on to Esther Shapiro, who will speak about her parents' experience and read the poem, Pain Strikes.
Hi, everybody. Well, my parents were both from Warsaw, Poland. My mother was the oldest of 5 children, and my father was the youngest of 4 children. They married at the outbreak of the war in 1939 and immediately left to Russian-occupied Poland and then on to Russia. Their families did not leave, as my mother's side of the family had small young children and my father had married sisters with children of their own. My parents fled to Russia and were constantly on the run to and from the Stan states, as my mother described it. Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and even came close to being in Siberia. She was once asked if she went on a honeymoon, and she said yes, a 7-year honeymoon until the end of the war, leaving from one place to another. My father was a barber by trade and kept in his pocket his survival tools, scissor and comb, to barter for food and shelter. My mother, who was blonde and blue-eyed, spoke 5 languages, fluent in Polish and Russian, some Czech and some German, didn't look typically Jewish, was the go-between and worked the black market, creating fake papers, crossing borders back and forth, and selling and trading to survive. My dad, at one time during the war, worked in a Russian coal mine labor camp by day. One story my mom shared with me is the potato story, which I must share with you all. At one time, all they had was potatoes. So she made the best of it and prepared a 7-course dinner for my dad when he came back from the coal mine. It started with potato soup, then potato pancakes, mashed potatoes, boiled potatoes, fried potatoes, baked potatoes, and for dessert, potato cocoa. My parents had a great sense of humor, and together with a hopeful, positive attitude, I believe that's what kept them alive. The stories that I was told were always heroic, ones that I am so grateful to keep that memory with me. By the end of the war, my parents returned to their home in Warsaw to find that not one of their immediate family survived. They were all alone. So from there, they went to Germany to a displaced person camp, and that's where I was born. We lived there for a few years. When I was 2 years old, we immigrated to America, and a new life began for us. My parents lived to the age of 96 and 97, and was able to live to see their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. They were happily married for 70 years, and I believe only having each other gave them the strength and will to live so long. My dad used to say that he knew the difference between heaven and hell. He had already lived in hell, and coming to America was living in heaven. And that's my story. Poems that I have is Pain Strikes Sparks on Me, the Pain of Tarzan. 15 beds, 15 charts with names, 15 people without a family tree, 15 bodies for whom torture is medicine and pills, beds over which the crimson blood of age spills. 15 bodies that want to live here, 30 eyes seeking quietness, bald heads that gape from out of the prison, the holiness of the suffering, which is none of my business, the loveliness of air, which day after day smells of strangeness and carbolic, the nurses that carry thermometers, mothers who grope after a smile. Food is such a luxury here, a long, long night and a brief day. But anyway, I don't want to leave. The lighted rooms and the burning cheeks, nurses who leave behind them only a shadow to help the little sufferers. I'd like to stay here, a small patient, waiting the doctor's daily rounds. Until after a long, long time, I'll be well again. Then I'd like to live and go back home again.
Thank you, Esther. Thanks for sharing those moving stories. I think I'm going to share your potato story at the Seder this year. I think it was amazing. Thanks again. The only bright spot for these children was their art teacher, Friedel Dicker Brandeis, who was able to create beauty even in these horrible circumstances. Friedel saw drawing and art as a way for the children to understand their emotions and cope with their environment. In this capacity, she was using art therapy. She used her art instruction as a means of spiritual survival. Friedel stayed with the children, even to their death, when many were transported to Auschwitz. And here on the screen now is a picture of Friedel Dicker Brandeis. Friedel collected 4,500 drawings of the children from Theresen and kept them in 2 suitcases, which she hid in one of the children's dormitories in the camp before she was transported to Auschwitz. These drawings were found after the war. Today, many of the art pieces hang in the Jewish Museum in Prague. On a personal note, my granddaughter Talia, many of you know, is an opera student. In 2019, Talia played Friedel in an opera performed at the Los Angeles Opera Camp. Her beautiful portrayal of Friedel was very meaningful to me and my family, and it inspired me to create this program. Here's a picture of Talia as Friedel. Thank you. We are about to show you some of the children's beautiful drawings. The children who were brought to Theresienstadt came from places where they already knew humiliation. They had been expelled from their schools. They were forced to wear yellow stars with the word Jew written in mock Hebraic type. They were only allowed to play in cemeteries. In the camp, they saw their grim reality, but still maintained a child's outlook on life. These drawings contain a range of emotions, from grief and anxiety, but also about dreams of spring, flowers, butterflies, merry-go-rounds, holidays, and family portraits, with a great longing to be happy and carefree once again. Friedel would tell the children stories, and the children drew what they heard and what they saw around them. They drew scenes from their concealed inner world and their tortured emotions. Friedel was able to enter these worlds and help heal them. She helped restore some hope to these terrified children. Most of these artists are unknown, but if you look closely, you can see that some of the children signed and dated their drawings. Thank you. Now we will hear from other children of survivors and listen to some more poems written by the children. I'd like now to call on Esther Friedberg, who will share her parents' experience in the Holocaust and then read a poem called A Letter to Daddy. Esther?
My parents, too, as some of the other stories, were not in the concentration camps, but this is their story. My parents met in Siberia in the Soviet Union. When the Nazis were making their way east through Poland, my father, Harry Langsam, and his brother and sister escaped eastward from Poland to the Soviet Union. My grandfather refused to leave their village of Strzyżew, Poland. He said he was too old. My mother, Anna Muravina, was from Kiev in the Ukraine. She was evacuated by the government along with many young people and sent to Siberia, where she worked as a civil servant. Harry and Anna met and fell in love in the midst of a Siberian winter during the war. My father was imprisoned there for a time, and she would visit him and bring him food. With a shortage of food and extreme cold weather, life was difficult, but they survived. They married on December 9, 1945 in Siberia. Their two witnesses at their wedding survived too. Yosef Stroy settled on a kibbutz in Israel, and Joe Davinsky ended up also in Los Angeles, where my father just happened to run into him on Fairfax Avenue. My parents made their way back after the war. They went east, but before they did, my father went back to his shtetl to see who survived. Unfortunately, his father did not. And at that time, they wrote each other letters. My father called them love letters. Those letters survived. When they made their way west to Germany, my father had all their letters, but the Soviet Union would not let them remove any documents. It didn't matter what. So he hid those letters under the train. And when they crossed the border and the train stopped, he ran out and retrieved his love letters. And to this day, I have those letters. After the war, they ended up in the displaced persons camp in Germany, where my sister Rima was born. They were granted permission to go to Israel. So in 1949, they went to Israel, where I was born. My father, many of you know, I grew up not hearing any sad stories. Life was full of parties and celebrations. The only thing that I noticed as I grew older was our house was packed with food. There wasn't enough room in the pantry. My dad kept building shelves to the pantry. The freezer was packed. The refrigerator was packed. There was always lots of food. And in hindsight, I see that it was the shortage of food in Siberia. And my mother also, she grew up in the Soviet Union during the 20s and 30s, and there were food shortages there too. So my father lost a brother, married sister, brother-in-law, and 2 children. And no, I'm sorry, that was my mother. My mother lost her brother and married sister. And my father lost his father, also a married sister, her husband, and 2 children. Although my dad's brother and other brother and sister survived, and they remained in Israel, and we came to the United States. And that's my story. So my poem is A Letter to Daddy. Mama told me to write you today, but I had no time. New children arrived with the latest transport, and I had to play with them. I didn't notice time pass. I live better these days. I sleep on my own mattress on the floor, so I will not fall down. At least I don't have much work to fix up my bed, and in the morning I see the sky from my window. I was coughing a bit, but I don't want to get sick, for I am happy when I can run in the courtyard. Tonight there will be a gathering, like the ones at Scout Camp in the summer. We will sing songs we know. A girl will play the accordion. I know you wonder how we fare here, and you would surely like to be with us now. And something else, Daddy. Come soon and have a more cheerful face. When you are unhappy, Mama is sad. And then I miss the sparkle in her eyes. You promised to bring me books, because truly I have nothing to read. So please, come tomorrow, right before dusk. I will surely be grateful for this. Now I must stop. Mama sends you her love. I will rejoice when I hear your footsteps in the hall until you are with us again. I send you my greetings and kisses, your faithful son, Anonymous.
Thank you, Esther. That was lovely. And thank you for sharing your parents' story. I know all of us seem to have the same experience where there was always a lot of food in the house. There was always bread on the table for every meal. There was bread, and that was probably very symbolic for all the Holocaust survivors. Thank you very much. The next speaker was supposed to be Mona Pollock, but unfortunately she can't attend tonight. But we're lucky to have Susan Miller, who will speak briefly, and then we'll read her poem called Terezin. Susan?
My boyfriend Fred's family were both in Terezin. His parents were survivors. He lost many aunts and uncles and his grandparents. Then they immigrated to Israel, where he was born, and he moved to the US when he was 9 years old. My poem is Terezin. That bit of filth in dirty walls and all around barbed wire, and 30,000 souls who sleep will once wake and once will see their own blood spilled. I was once a little child, 3 years ago, that child who longed for other worlds. But now I am no more a child, for I have learned to hate. I am a grown-up person now. I have known fear. Bloody words and a dead day then. That's something different than boogeymen. But anyway, I still believe I only sleep today, that I'll wake up a child again and start to laugh and play. I'll go back to childhood sweet like a briar rose, like a bell that wakes us from a dream, like a mother with an ailing child loves him with aching woman's love. How tragic then is youth that lives with enemies, with gallows ropes. How tragic then for children on your lap to say, this for the good, that for the bad. Somewhere far away out there, childhood sweetly sleeps. Along that path among the trees, there or that house. That was once my pride and joy. There my mother gave me birth into this world, so I could weep. In the flames of candles on my bed, by my bed, I sleep, and once perhaps I'll understand that I was such a little thing, as little as this song. These 30,000 souls who sleep among the trees will wake, open an eye, and because they see a lot, they'll fall asleep again. This is from 1944.
Thank you, Susan, very much for filling in for Mona and sharing your Fred's story. Very, very appropriate for today's topic. Thanks again. Our next speaker will be Tzippi Barron. Tzippi will speak briefly about her parents' experience and then read the poem, I Am a Jew. Tzippi?
Hi. Both of my parents were Holocaust survivors. My mother was a young girl. She was 14 years old. When the war started, they were in the city lodge and they heard screaming and yelling. So they looked out from the window and they saw the Germans took books from a synagogue and they threw it. So my grandfather decided we have to run. So they went down, they were not the only ones, thousands of people ran to the river so they can cross the river and get into Russia. They went all the way until Tashkent. They got other end job so they can survive. Then after the war, they came back to Poland, to Lodz, to see if there is family left. Unfortunately, it wasn't too many. My grandfather lost his brothers and sisters, the same my grandmother, and they lost 2 children. One son was shot. He was stealing an apple to eat. He was hungry. And the other one died from typhus. My father was married before the war. His wife told him, begged him, run, because women and children, nobody is gonna touch. He had 2 young kids, 7 and 5. Obviously, when he came back, he found out that they went to Auschwitz. They went. So they came back and they met at the aunt's house. So my father was older than my mother, 22 years. But he was a good-looking guy. She was a beautiful girl, and they got married. And on the way from Poland, they stopped in Germany in a DP camp, and there where I was born, and from there we went to Israel. I did hear stories, mainly after my father died. My father died, I was 15 years old. But we felt at home. He didn't let us cross the street by ourselves. We couldn't do what we wanted to do. He was scared for us if something will happen. So we did feel. But after it passed, yes, we heard stories at home for my mother's family mainly. Yeah, it was a very sad time for them, but they were very happy with us. They were, like Esther said, the refrigerator was always full. It was no room where to put in something. And one thing is very important, that my mother never forced us to eat. When we said, we don't like that, we don't like to say, thank God you're not hungry. Kids that were hungry, they ate everything. So those things are staying with me because I do the same thing to my grandchildren. If they don't want to eat, so be it, it's okay. When they're going to be hungry, they're going to eat. Okay, I am a Jew. I am a Jew and will be a Jew forever. Even if I should die from hunger, never will I submit. I will always fight for my people, on my honor. I will never be ashamed of them. I give my word. I am proud of my people, how delightful they are. Even though I am suppressed, I will always come back to life. This poem was written by, we don't know if it's a boy or a girl, Frenta Bess. And by the way, I went with my friends Michael and Colleen Regan to Theresienstadt, and they were in a shock to see what happened. They know about the Holocaust, but they didn't get in so much details. They were verklempt for a couple hours, they couldn't talk. That's my story.
Thank you, Tzipi. Thank you so much for sharing. And I did receive those pictures that you sent me of the camp, and they were very meaningful. And
Yeah.
Thank you very much for participating. Our next speaker is Rini Peters. Rini is going to tell us about her parents' experience and then read the poem At Theresian by Teddy. Rini?
Rini, you're on mute.
Let me put myself on.
Now?
Good.
Okay. I've been listening to everybody, their various family experiences. And when Susan asked me to do this, I didn't know where to start. My parents, according to the story, knew each other from diapers. My dad fell in love with my mother when the governess changed her diaper. The two governesses were good friends. So that's part of the story I grew up with. But as time went on, you know, in those days, everybody hung out in groups. It was not, you weren't coupled up or anything. But my parents did ice skate as a couple at 8 and 12 years old, 4 years difference between them. By 14, my mother knew that this was going to be her husband, my father, even though he was very popular. And when we went back to Munkach, he showed us the balcony where he would take the other girls. In the balcony in the movie theater, where he would take the other girls, not my mom, because she was a good girl. He got arrested as part of the underground, and Susan Isaacs knows this story because her relative was one of my father's best friends. And they were arrested together. My mind just went in all kinds of different places. My mother's family was well known in the community because they had a brick factory. After my mom died, I found this plastic bag marked Shayevich Brick Factory, August 1993. My parents took my family back to Munkach, where they were born and raised. The brick factory still stands. It's still making bricks 70, 80 years later. And found this between her things. What I also have are these boots. My father wore these during the war. Everything was handmade at the time, and he survived 4 years wearing these boots. He was not in Auschwitz. He was in a labor camp. But this is one of the things I have from him. My grandmother, Serena, who I'm named after, was not well. And like I said, my mind is just jumping around with all these thoughts. Wanted to just be done, not to have to go through what they felt was coming at the time. And my mother and her older sister, Irene, would not let Grandma Serena end her life without them. And she wanted her girls to survive. So one of my mother's biggest regrets, I think, well, I know, was had she allowed Serena to commit suicide, basically, she would know where Grandma's buried. Now, we don't know that. But when Grandma Serena, Auntie Irene, and Mom got off the train to Auschwitz, they were met by Mengele. This is one of the stories I will never forget. And he was separating them to the right, to the left. And my mom always said that she looked to her mother and she said, "Will I ever see Lou again?" My dad. And my grandma said, "Yes, you will." My mother said she never saw her mother again, but she did see Lou, and here we are. And the only other thing I can say at that point is, before there was such a thing as promise rings, evidently my dad had given my mom a ring we're talking like 18, 19, 20 years old. My mom was in Auschwitz at 18. And they loaded up the ghetto at the brick factory. I just told you about at the brick factory. And there was a pond over there because the brick factory had a railroad siding. And my mother threw her promise ring, as it were, into the pond at the brick factory so they couldn't get it from her. So I don't know, maybe it's still today buried at the bottom of the pond because the factory still exists. My mother, till recently, still existed. And, you know, maybe the ring still's there because there are people at that brick factory that are still working there. They're the next generation of employees that my mother's family hired. So it's a very interesting turn of events. The history goes on, and Susie Isaacs and Joyce, and I need to tell you ladies, this is like one of the most amazing programs I have ever seen, let alone be a part of. And thank you for that. And I will read my poem. It's called At Terezin by Teddy. When a new child comes, everything seems strange to him. What, on the ground I have to lie? Eat black potatoes? No, not I. I've got to stay, it's dirty here. The floor, why look, it's dirt, I fear. And I'm supposed to sleep on it, I'll get all dirty. Hear the sound of shouting, cries, and oh, so many flies. Everyone knows flies carry disease. Oh, something bit me. Wasn't that a bed bug? Here in Terezin, life is hell. And when I'll go home, I can't yet tell.
Thank you so much, Rini, for sharing your beautiful stories about your parents. What a beautiful love story your parents had. And I remember when we were at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, we saw a picture on the wall, and your mother was in
Oh
that
my
picture,
gosh.
right? She had pigtails and big white bows. And I could just see that picture right now. And you pointed to her and said, that's my mom. And another thing, Rini, you know, our mothers were 10 years apart, exactly.
Mm.
My mother was 10 years older than your mom. They had the same birthday.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So we just experienced their well, that's coming up March 27th.
27th.
March 27th. My mother was 10
My mom was a Pesach baby, as was yours.
That's my mother, and we've always been connected over the years.
Mm. And Oscar.
And Oscar, I hope Alice is on now, but I'm not sure, but she'll definitely relate to your beautiful stories.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for sharing, Rini.
Thank you for asking me.
Okay. Now, our last speaker for this evening is Leah Templer. Leah will now share some of her parents' experiences in the Shoah and then read the poem Theresienstadt Hospital. Leah?
Leah, unmute yourself, please.
My parents were not in concentration camps. However, my mother was born in Warsaw, but ended up was raised in Brussels, Belgium. And when the war broke out, the Germans decided to liberate Brussels of all Jews. So they started marching south. And her brother and her father started to march with many other Jews and many of her friends. And somewhere along the march, she lost track of her father and her brother, but she and her friends ended up walking all the way south and ended up giving themselves up in the Swiss border. They were the first time kicked out. The second time they tried to get in, they were allowed to come in because one of the women was pregnant and showing, and the guard took pity of them. Switzerland had one simple rule: you can stay as long as you can support yourself. So she ended up in Switzerland for 4 years. My father's a different story. My father moved to Germany in the early 30s, and in 1933 was actually arrested by the Nazis in Leipzig. He was in a detention center for 2 weeks, released because the guard who interviewed him said my father was very dark, had a lot of hair on his arms and his legs and very blackish hair. And somebody whispered to my father, "You're an Arab, aren't you?" And when the guard interviewed him, he told the guard he was Arab, and so they released him. He ended up in Paris after that. And the plan was with his family that he and his other brother would settle in Paris. So if something went wrong in Germany, the rest of the family would join them. Unfortunately, the rest of the family made the mistake of going back. My father was from Stanislav, like my Baron's family, and they were all shot and thrown into pits in Stanislav. My uncle in Paris was arrested. He was a plumber, and he was taken to Auschwitz at the very beginning to build the gas chambers. And when the men realized what they were going to be doing, he was hung. And there used to be a picture of him hanging in Yad Vashem. My father ended up volunteering for the French army and put in the Polish division, mostly Jews. And as they were supposed to walk to the front in Belgium, they made a right turn and gave themselves up as prisoners of war to Switzerland. So my father ended up in the mountains in Switzerland for 5 years. My father met my mother during the war. Neither one of them knew what was happening in the rest of the world because they were totally shut off. And so when my father was liberated in 45, that's when they found out what had happened to and they were the only 2 survivors. And so they went to Paris, back to Paris, got married, and here I came. And my mother's attitude about Europe overall was she had to get away. So originally we were supposed to immigrate to New Zealand. That didn't work out. So we ended up in the United States, and it had to be the West Coast because that was as far as she could go away from Europe and away from war. That's my story. Yeah, my poem, Theresienstadt's Hospital. Once happier people lived there in the gray building. Now death moves silently towards those other creatures, those with typhoid who moan and writhe in their own diarrhea, who lie here and don't understand why they are being fed bread and margarine. I enter and become silent. You shiny new doorknobs, you pretty painted walls in the bright ward. Can you make up for the stench of excrement? Can you appease the hunger of those who are ashamed of their underwear and brought here to die day by day? The paint looks at me and doesn't answer. Why? I don't understand. Why? It seems the doorknob would say, when it opened for me, a free soul with a full stomach, I can tell you, and then you will come to me. This was anonymous.
Thank you so much, Leah, for sharing your words with all of us. I remember the first time I met you and we started talking, you told me you were born in Paris, and I didn't know any Jewish girls born in Paris. But now I understand how your parents got there, what they experienced, and why you were born there. So thank you.
I agree with Rini. This is the best program we've ever had. Thank you for putting it together.
Pleasure. Thank you. Yeah.
Susie,
I'd like to conclude.
Susie,
Yes, Esther?
it's me. Can I just share? I totally forgot. I got too emotional, and I wanted to share photos of my parents. Can I just put them up real quick?
Absolutely.
So my parents from around 1945,
Wow, look at them.
and then my parents in the States.
Mhm.
Okay, just wanted to share.
They were beautiful young, and they were beautiful when they were older, Esther.
I remember them. They were the first people that I met when I came to Los Angeles.
Thank you
That's
so
true.
much.
They loved me very
That's
much.
true.
They didn't know who I am, but they loved me. That's what I felt.
Okay.
Well,
I would-
and on an interesting note, Rachel spoke earlier about her parents, Rachel Kurtz, and I grew up with Rachel here in LA because many of the survivors, as you know, just sought each other out. And so they found each other, Rachel's parents, my parents.
They were the best friends.
And some others. And
My parents were part of that group too.
right. The point is that
Yes.
once they were here, once they were survivors, they left that behind, and
Right.
they did nothing but party and enjoy life to the fullest,
Absolutely.
You're lucky. That was a very nice group. I don't believe my parents did that. I think they carried around a lot of trauma with them and even passed that along to me and my brother to a certain degree. But anyway, I'd like to conclude tonight's program with some words of hope. Anne Frank's words seem very fitting at this time. She wrote, "In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. I don't think of all the misery, but the beauty that still remains." We at Naamat see the beauty in the faces of the small children and the women that we help in Israel. We work hard every day to give them a better life by supporting our daycare centers, our vocational high schools, by preventing domestic violence and supporting educational scholarships. The Israeli national anthem is called Hatikva, which means hope. And we try to bring hope to all the less fortunate than ourselves. The best way we can honor those who died in the Holocaust is to create a world of equality, justice, and dignity for all. However, as Jews, we must be aware of the disturbing rise in anti-Semitism that is resurfacing everywhere. It's all around us, and it's our duty to ensure that the atrocities of the Holocaust will never happen again. That is the profound importance of those powerful words, never again. I hope that our presentation this evening showed you something new, a glimpse into the experience of the children of Theresienstadt. May they always be remembered. In closing, I'd like to share a video created last year by children in the UK Jewish community. They created a moving Yom HaShoa performance called Never Again.
There
Thank you. I'd like to again thank our speakers this evening, Sandy, Etty, Rachel, Esther Shapiro, Esther Friedberg, Sippy, Rini, and Leah, for sharing such personal stories about their parents and for doing such a wonderful job reading the children's moving poems. I also want to thank our technical team, Joyce and Deanna, for helping with tonight's presentation, and to all of you who tuned in. Thank you, good night, and have a happy and healthy Passover.
Let's give Susan a round of applause for such a wonderful